Built by the Nile, architecture, life, and power in ancient Egypt. Hello, and welcome to today's journey through time and architecture with yours truly, Edwin Adrian Villegas. This is a podcast presentation on Arc 432 architecture history. We'll dive in the architecture of ancient Egypt, focusing on the fertile and historically rich region of the Nile Delta. Together, we'll explore how geography shaped monumental architecture and temples and pyramids, how these structures reflect religious and political power, and how everyday objects and buildings tell us about the lives of ordinary Egyptians. This is a map of ancient Egypt and the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta, often called the Gift of the Nile, is a lush, triangle region in northern Egypt. The Nile River fans out into many branches before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. In ancient times, it served as a significance of agriculture and trading hub. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was Egyptians' lifeblood. It detected where people could live, what they could grow, and ultimately what they could build. Images of the Nile flood cycle and farmland. The annual flooding of the Nile caused by heavy rains in East Africa fertilized the delta's soil, making it incredibly rich for agriculture. This natural rhythm allowed Egyptians to plan their farming and construction according to the seasons. Like across Egypt, architecture in the Nile Delta was influenced by the cycle. Mud brick became the go-to material for everyday buildings, while stone was reserved for the eternal tombs, temples, and monuments. On the left side, there's an aerial of Giza Plateau pyramids, and on the right side, there is an image of the Great Pyramid's alignment with the constellations. Let's begin with the most iconic architectural symbols of ancient Egypt, the pyramids. The Great Pyramids of Giza, located just south of the Delta, were built as tombs for the pharaohs and were meant to last forever. The pyramids in Khufu, Great Pyramid, are astronomically precise in their alignment with the skies above. Scholars like Mark Lenner have noticed that these alignments mirrors the cardinal points, emphasizing a cosmic connection between the heavens, the Nile, and the architecture. Egyptians' monuments were not just stone blocks, they embodied celestial order and royal power, a quote by Lenner in The Complete Pyramids. Diagram of a complex temple, like Karnak. On the left side, we have a floor plan image of Karnak, and on the right side, we have a great hypostyle hall column that is in Karnak. Temples in ancient Egypt, like the ones at Karnak or Heliopolis, weren't just impressive buildings. They were considered the actual homes of the gods and the powerful symbols of divine rule. Most temples followed a straight, organized layout, guiding worshippers from the outer courtyard into the most sacred inner chamber. In the Nile Delta, many of these temples also included ceremonial lakes that connected back to the river itself, making the presence of the Nile feel even more spiritual. The godlike Hapi, who represented the Nile and its life-giving floods, was often honored with offerings and rituals. Temple reliefs showing rituals. As you can see above, there are two images of temple reliefs that are beautifully carved out within the walls of the temples or even columns within the temples. And they show beautiful representations of how ancient Egyptian civilizations provided objects that they have hand created and sacrificed animals to their gods. Religion was deeply tied to geography within the Nile. The Nile was not just a water source, but a sacred access where rituals often included offerings to the gods for a successful flood, and temples were built near water sources to symbolize cosmic rebirth. As Emily Teeter writes in Religion and Ritual in Ancient Egypt, the architecture of a temple was a stage for the performance of the divine drama, reflecting both human and natural cycles. Urban planning in Delta towns. In the images above, you can see a photo of an excavation site in Tel El Daba and also a site plan of Tel El Daba. While temples and pyramids grab the headlines, the towns and cities of the Delta, like Tanis and Tel El Daba, reveal the everyday reality of Egyptian life. Tel El Daba, once the capital of Ikosos rulers, had a hybrid architectural style, mixing Egyptian and Levantine influences. Excavation reveals mud brick houses, storage garnets, and temples, suggesting a complex, multi-ethnic society. On the right, you can see an image of a section, floor plan, elevation, and isometric of a typical house of Tel El Amarna. Let's look at a typical home along the Nile in ancient Egypt. These houses were simple but deeply connected to their environment, built from sun-dried mud brick, an abundant and practical material. They blend naturally into the dusty landscape. The roofs were flat, perfect for sleeping under the stars during a hot summer night, and small inner courtyards brought light and air into the center of the homes. Rooms were arranged with care to stay cool during the sweltering months, showing how thoughtfully the architecture responded to the climate. Inside these homes tells quite stories of daily life. Pottery used for cooking and storage sits near clay ovens. Loom weights hint at weaving done by hand, likely by the household women. These everyday items reflect a rhythm of living that followed the rising and falling of the Nile. Life here wasn't grand or royal. It was ordinary, seasonal, and sacred, shaped by the land and water that sustained it. Artifact, painted pottery, and tools, even small objects can tell big stories. Like the ones on the right, a lot of them have images and heads of gods and pharaohs. A lot of the pottery was painted, seemingly like there was a story trying to be told. And a lot of the tools on the top that ancient Egypt civilizations used on a daily for fishing look like animals and gods and symbols, probably to help them with their everyday fishing and farming. Even small objects can tell big stories. Take, for instance, pottery with geometric patterns, reed mats, or fish traps. These artifacts show that the Nile was not only for travel or irrigation, it fed families and inspired design motifs. Everyday objects became miniature monuments to the lives that were lived outside of the temples and tombs. A quote said by Barry Kemp in Ancient Egypt: Autonomy of a Civilization. Agriculture and storage buildings. On the top, you could see the big and beautiful river Nile as ancient civilization travels on their bigger boats and on the smaller canoes they use for fishing. Cattle roam around inland, grain storage, winnowing, removing husks, threshing floor where the grain is separated from the stalks, irrigation channel where they brought the water from the Nile inland for more irrigation, and hummingbirds on the top right. Architecture in the Nile wasn't just about homes or temples. It also helped keep entire communities fed and thriving. Granaries and storehouses were typical in many settlements, usually at the town's center. Their location tells us something important. Managing food and resources was a shared responsibility, especially after the annual Nile floods. When the water receded and the land turned rich and fertile, the harvesting came in, and these buildings became lifeline. They weren't as grand or decorative as the temples, but just as essential to everyday life. These structures held grain, oil, and other supplies that would carry people through the dry seasons and challenging times. They reveal how architecture supported everyday life and survival in their quiet, practical way. Artistic representation of workers and builders. Above, you can see two images of workers chiseling and carving away at gold and different materials to create tools and ancient artifacts. Also, on the right side, you can see them carving away at the walls inside these tombs to provide hieroglyphics. Let's not forget the people who built Egypt. Wall paintings, like those in the tombs of Khmer, show builders, masons, and artisans at work. They weren't enslaved, they were skilled laborers, often state employed and fed through the temple rations. Today's architecture is a product of many hands: engineers, farmers, artists, and bureaucrats. God happy and the symbolism of the Nile, as depicted in the image on the right. Egyptians worshiped the Nile as a god, Happy, often depicted as a plump, androgynous figure symbolizing abundance. Temple reliefs show pharaohs offering meat or divine order to Happy. The symbolism extended to architecture. Structures were aligned to the river, built with materials it provided, and designed to channel its sacred energy. Symbolism in architecture, lotus and papyrus columns. On the right, you can see multiple iterations of lotus and papyrus columns that were designed during ancient civilization times. Taking a closer look at the top of ancient Egyptian temple columns, you'll notice that they're shaped like lotus flowers and papyrus plants. These weren't just artistic choices. The lotus and papyrus symbolize Upper and Lower Egypt, and using them together in architecture was like a visual prayer for unity and balance across the land. Every column wasn't just holding up a roof, it was carrying a message of peace and connected life of the Nile. The Nile, in mythology and afterlife Khufu boat. On the right, you see a scaled down version of the ancient Egyptian Khufu boat. And on the left is a scribe that has drawings of a herring and people traveling within these Khufu boats. The Nile was also imagined in the afterlife. In the Book of the Dead, the deceased sail through the river to reach paradise. Tombs were filled with boats models like the famous Khufu boat to aid this journey. So the Nile was the ultimate pathway in both life and death. Nile temple ruins in museums today. Within the images, you can see temple ruins displayed within museums. On the right, you can see that the temple ruins were stripped away from its original location and brought in for people to view, take cameras, and take pictures. The Nile still flows steady as ever, but now it winds past ruins instead of rituals. The temple no longer echoes with prayers. They have become museums and a way to return to the past. The pyramids were once sacred monuments and are now landmarks for tourists and cameras. To this day, something powerful remains within these structures. While standing among these ancient Egyptian structures, you can still feel their presence and life as they speak to us, reminding us that architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about memory, meaning, and our connection to place. To end this podcast, I leave you with two beautiful depictions of how ancient civilization was farming. The architecture of ancient Egypt by the Nile wasn't just about the stone and symmetry, but way more than spiritually. It was a mirror of geography with many tools of political power and reflection of everyday life and power. From the pyramids to the clay ovens in the humble homes, the flow of the Nile shaped everything. And thank you for listening today. I'm Edwin Adrian Viegas, and I hope this journey through Egypt's architectural past helped you see how deeply place, power, and people were connected. Until next time, bye.